Shalom from Tel Aviv. My name is Michal Chatuel. With me in the studio is Dr. Udi Eran. Hi, Udi.
Hi, Michal.
And joining us from Washington, D.C. is Dr. Scott Lasensky. Scott?
Hi. Hi, Michal. Hi, Udi.
Hi. Good morning to you in Washington. So in advance of our, the Futures Workshop, which is a central section of this year's Z3 conference, the three of us are here today to speak a bit about the methodology we all have some experience with, which is the same methodology that will underlie the Z3 Futures Workshop, and that is wargaming. So the term wargaming is in some places used interchangeably with the word simulating, which describes the crux of what is done in these games. I'd say that in the context of the Z3 conference and the scenario of the game we're dealing with, a more fitting word for wargaming is indeed simulating. So what am I talking about when I say that the upcoming Z3 Futures Workshop is based on simulating? When we simulate a situation in a research or a learning-oriented environment, which can be a conference, a workshop, a seminar, a roundtable discussion, we typically engage in an analytic game in which we step into someone else's shoes and play out a scenario that was carefully developed in advance. The someone that we simulate can be a country, for example, Israel and the United States. It can be an entity, for example, the UN, or Jewish Israelis and Jewish Americans. It can even be a person, for example, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Playing the country or the entity or the persona is usually a team of people. Now, typically, the team playing a specific side has in-depth knowledge about the side they are simulating. So, for example, if I'm playing the UN in a game about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the Israeli government in a game about Israel-world Jewry relations, it's because I've conducted research in both of these fields. I have a base of knowledge about how these entities have behaved in different situations. But sometimes we can also add a twist by asking non-experts to play a side or an entity. This can often result in a response that the experts, who already think in some form of knowledge-based patterns, could not come up with by themselves. So after this very theoretical explanation, let's try and make the idea of simulating, which will be used in the Z3 conference, more tangible. And I'll start with you, Udi. So can you share from your experience about what a simulation game looks like? Take us to the behind the scenes of a simulation game.
Okay, Michal, thank you. It's rather straightforward along the lines of what you described. So the participants are divided to different entities, normally 2-3 experts in each team. They are allotted some time to discuss what are their preferences, what are their priorities. And then the management of the game will offer a scenario, which usually requires some of the actors to take action. So in one of the simulations I participated, it modeled the Israeli-Iranian tension. Iran arrived at a bomb, and all the actors had to interact with each other, take decisions. More nuanced simulations that I had the chance to participate more recently also take into account the role of media. So actors are supposed to make a decision and then present it in some media environment. And there's some interaction, of course, between what goes in the media and how you play it. So that's pretty much it.
Thanks, Udi. Let's see, Scott. You're in the US. You are familiar with the Z3 Futures Workshop and the organization in general. It's a bit of a different context to what Udi described, perhaps. My question to you is if you think that the simulation, the Z3 simulation, will be similar to what Udi has described here today. How will it be similar? How will it be different?
Thank you, Michal. Sure, it's not the national security field. It's not going to be a typical foreign policy war game, the intensity of conflict, of life or death decision making. But I think a lot will be similar. Having a robust scenario, the role playing, taking the fresh eyes perspective, trying to get out of the groupthink that often can bedevil institutions or even state actors. It's a really important exercise in getting out of your comfort zone, having the pressure of the scenario, some time pressure, and coming up with practical ideas, new ideas. In this context, I think in Z3, maybe we'll talk about it more, and I know Udi has views on this as well, getting away from the improvisational nature that usually turns out to produce bad outcomes. That's really the crux of the game. In the national security sphere, between states, the UN, militaries, at this level, improvisation, there's always a degree of it, but there's a lot of established patterns. I think the kind of scenario that the conference is going to look at is touching on an area that's particularly prone to improvisation. And in that sense, the game, in many respects, in Palo Alto is even more important than many of the games that I'm used to engaging in.
So the underlying commonality, Scott, is the improvisation. Where do you see the difference between the kind of setting that Udi has described and the setting that you have participated in simulating in the Foreign Office, the Foreign Ministry, or State Department?
Well, I should add there. The other similarities are, a crisis that developed, an unexpected crisis, having multiple players. In the Israel diaspora space, there are certainly multiple players. In that sense, it's a very realistic. It's a very realistic scenario when you compare it to a national security crisis, where you often have multiple players between states, within states. It's not as Israel diaspora relations aren't quite as crisis prone as in the global diplomacy and the national security sphere. But again, as I said, I think it's even more prone to improvisation given the lack of established patterns and norms and clear institutions. If you look at the high point of the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, there were crises, but at least each leader had the red phone they could pick up, and it was clear who needed to talk to who. It's not always so clear in the Israel diaspora realm. So again, in a sense, the scenario and the exercise in Palo Alto, in many respects, is going to be even more important than the kind of games that I'm used to in the national security and foreign policy field.
Interesting perspective. Thanks, Scott. I'd like to ask both of you, I'll ask you first, Udi, can you share a Eureka moment that you had in those games where you sat and you saw a situation unfold and then you thought to yourself, wow, this is something that I couldn't have arrived at by myself through reading papers or through maybe side discussions with some experts?
So I'll make maybe two broad points, not maybe illustrate them with a story. One is I was amazed in at least two games with the role of emotions. We tend to think of these games as run by rational actors who have clear sets of preferences, but under the time pressure and constraints and the need to decide, sometimes an emotional part comes out, which of course makes you think what role does emotions have in general in decision making. I have two examples of that. One, I participated as a mentor for a training exercise for relatively junior officers in the IDF who were playing different countries, and we were their more senior mentors. But at some point, the game so overtook us that we began playing. We sort of pushed aside the more junior people and got completely into it, forgetting that our role was actually guiding and mentoring. That was one example. The second one, when I was in graduate school in the US, we played Middle Eastern scenario with very senior people who came out of the administration, and some of them actually are now back in the administration. And at some moment, one of them had a burst against essentially Israel. And you got a clear moment of what this person what his emotional approach towards us. Although he's a very detached person, it was very hard to understand that earlier. So I was amazed how much emotions take role within this supposedly rationalistic context. The second aha moment I had actually in INSS, the organization you were in for so many years. We were playing a scenario of the tension between Israel and Syria. That was in the early days of Israeli covert attacks on Syria. And the gentleman that played Syria, Moti Dimenstein, you may know him, his approach was not to do anything. So although the game and real life prompts you to take action, his approach was actually not to take action, and he insisted on that, although clearly there was some psychological pressure to do something. And it was the right decision on his part. So I also learned that sometimes decision making is not making a decision, maybe not applicable to our game in Palo Alto, but clearly for real life.
Interesting. Scott, can you share a Eureka moment with us, a surprise that
Sure.
you may recall? Yeah.
I mean, well, even before the Eureka moment, I would say I was, I'll never forget in the late 2011, throughout 2012 and into 2013, when I was in the Obama administration working on Syria issues, there was a particular White House advisor, and she insisted on gaming out scenarios, mostly around the use of chemical weapons. So I'll give you an example of the Eureka moment, but just the very fact of someone pushing the system. There were a lot of other actors, different agencies, people skeptical. Is this really the most likely scenario? She was spot on. By August of 2013, there was a major use of chemical weapons. There was it may look different on the outside, but on the inside, people, senior officials, agencies had been drilling for a year. And the utility, the importance of drilling, of trying to, again, you can never eliminate improvisation, but trying to minimize it, working through those scenarios, working through the playbook of actions. I'll leave the names aside, but that exercise, mostly throughout 2012 and early 2013, had a major positive impact on how we reacted. My Eureka moment would, I would just say in general, in many of the games that I've participated in my mind, it's the importance of managing both public messaging and the private communication that actually gets you to some arrangement. I've been in games where sometimes some of the actors lean a little too much toward messaging, as if statements to the media can somehow resolve a process on its own. And then there are those who focus entirely on the private channels. The games, I think, that most accurately reflect the way scenarios play out, particularly in the international realm, are when there's equal attention paid to what messaging is being delivered outside, which you can control a little more, and the other side is usually paying attention to, but also never losing sight of the private channels, making sure they're regular, they're clear. The toughest scenarios are when you don't have clear lines of communications and you're dealing through an intermediary. Let's say the U.S. and Syria in the scenario that I was describing, we were often passing things through the Russians. So again, in brief, just being very focused on managing those private channels of communication between the actors, trying to reach a decision, some kind of a soft landing to the crisis, but also paying the right attention to the public messaging, using the media to reinforce your response to the crisis.
So that would be your tips, perhaps, for conducting a good simulation or keeping the simulation on track. One point to Udi is that I completely agree with you about how people become emotional, and maybe to our audience that haven't witnessed these kind of simulations, it's unbelievable how there's kind of a suspension of disbelief.
Yes.
You step into the figure, you really become part of the debate and emotions, and I completely agree with you. I'll share
That's
also...
a good sign, by the way.
It's a good sign. It's a good sign. Yes.
Yeah, it's a good sign.
We want that to happen. Yes. I had a small Eureka moment when I was in a game and we were simulating Israelis and part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, different scenarios. And in one of the discussions that we had, the outcome was that Hamas and Fatah actually reconciliated. And the first thing was to say, no, it will never happen. But in the game, it happened. And then we had to, continue with that scenario. So definitely, I think there's a lot to look forward to and potentially interesting scenarios that could emerge. Now, I want to hinge off your last words, Scott, when you referred to maybe best practices. You gave us some tips about what could be done not to derail the game. I want to ask Udi, because in earlier conversations that we had, Udi did express some concerns about this specific scenario, right? We are dealing with Jewish peoplehood, we are dealing with Zionism, with the emerging gap or the growing gap between the State of Israel and the United States Jewish community. And you expressed some concern that maybe this dilemma, this situation, this scenario is not so feasible for playing out in a simulation game. Yeah. So I'd be happy to hear about your concerns. And Scott, please listen in, because I'm going to ask you about how you think that we can address all these concerns.
Yeah. Now, I should start by saying I commend the organizers for taking this bold move of playing this out as a game. I think it's creative, out of the box, and will lead to interesting outcomes. My intuitive concerns were, first of all, a lot of the games we all participated in were power-based, interest-based. Whereas I think in the American-Israeli Jewish triangle, there's also questions of identity, of culture. We ask ourselves what our identity, what is our commitment to our brothers and sisters. And so intuitively, it's like two somewhat separate worlds. It's not only about power, it's also about other things. The second dimension was speed. These games, as we all know, in the national security realm, usually there's a tight deadline, tanks are driving, there's an ultimatum from some country, a nuclear bomb has just evolved. Whereas I think the Israeli diaspora relations is a much slower process, sometimes responding to global challenges, to the way mindsets of elites change over time. And so it's a different time scale. And I guess the third issue, Scott already hinted to that, is that in these national security games, there are clear defined entities with authorities that have to take decisions. Whereas in the Israel diaspora, there are multiple actors. It's not exactly clear what's the authority of any, maybe on the Israeli side. Even on the Israeli side, there are multiple actors. And so it makes it much more complex, interesting, challenging, but maybe more fruitful.
I agree. I have a lot to say, but let's hear Scott first. Scott?
First of all, thank you. It's a great question. Udi, it was a great answer. I'll pick up on one thing you said to reinforce, in many respects, this is all the more important in this Israel diaspora realm because of the lack of, who's responsible for what. There's also not just an institutional gap, there's a normative gap. What are the rules of the road? You may think it's a crazy example, but take the 1990-91 Gulf crisis. Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. It's a breach of a major and a recognized international norm. There's a UN Security Council resolution saying, that has to be reversed. A lot of improvisational diplomacy to back it up, but at least the general array is clearly demarcated. A game like this, even if, and you're absolutely right, Udi, the yom-yom, the day-to-day conduct of Israel diaspora relations tends not to have these kind of crisis moments, though occasionally they pop up. We remember the late June 2017 collapse of the Kotel framework. But I think this exercise is so fruitful because by injecting a little bit of that intensity, it might get people to relax their usual or the normal resignation to the array that we do have, which is this kind of messy arrangement where there aren't clear rules of the road. Again, also a messy institutional framework where there's lots of actors. It's not clear who has the authority, government of Israel, Jewish agency, different umbrella frameworks in the diaspora. And maybe through the game and through the injection of a little time intensity, we can have some reflection and think and come out, how can we solve the crisis and come up with a little bit of a better checklist for the next a moment of decision that comes around the corner, but what are the big fixes? What are the big solutions that might improve and make this relationship, this set of relationships, which is not going to go away, make it operate more effectively? I'll just give you one concrete example. This government, this new government, now passed the budget decision in the Knesset. They've staked part of their platform on trying to develop a consultation framework, an Israel diaspora a formalized consultation framework that could bring some kind of regular tempo. It doesn't mean the solutions are easier to get to, but at least there's a framework that can guide who sits at the table on what issues and can develop solutions. So I think the exercise has its own merit, but hopefully it also holds up a mirror and can allow us to reflect a little bit on the gaps and what's missing in the relationship and think a little harder about what might fix these going forward.
I would agree. I actually think that the fact that there are multiple players, and Scott and Udi, not only you refer to multiple players in the US, that the Jewish community is very dispersed. Scott also spoke about the Israeli government. There's multiple players in Israel as well. There's civil society. Within the government, there are a number of different ministries dealing with issues relating to diaspora Jewry and American Jewry. So I think that could inject a lot of different dimensions that could make the game actually very interesting. Scott, I want to ask you, because of your familiarity with your immersed in, you're part of this community that we're speaking about in the United States. We're here from Israel. How would you define a successful simulation? You know, what would you tell the organizers of the Z3 conference if you had to draw out some indicators to say, okay, this simulation was very successful? What would you say?
It's a great question. Part I would turn back to you and to Udi and say, if that passion, if the emotion is there, if you see people kind of at the edge of their seats, maybe even some people, some feelings get ruffled, maybe even some raised voices. To me, that's the sort of the gut check that during the scenario, things are going well. I would say the after action, if people are, remain engaged on the edge of their seat when you're doing those readouts, when you're comparing notes and the sort of the after action element of the scenario, that's another good sign. And then, number three, whether or not creative solutions emerge. A scenario, like you said on the Hamas-Fatah game, Michal, if something, some different twist emerges, or if a novel solution comes out, people will know if the game is successful. I mean, for the participants and for the hosts, I would also remind it's going to show my my age, but here in Washington, whether you're Republican or Democrat, everybody cites Jim Baker, former Secretary of State Jim Baker. He often he spoke about, usually laced with some profanities, but in his books and in his public speaking, he cites his grandfather who pushed this mantra, the 5 Ps. Prior preparation prevents poor performance. It's a good mantra for anything in life, but particularly for simulations and wargaming. Preparation, fine-tuning that scenario, having the curveballs ready for the twists and turns, having the players ready to play their roles, to be well briefed. Preparation really is the key to starting a game that's going to be both realistic and productive.
I couldn't agree more. Udi, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think, again, I completely agree with Scott. I'd add maybe 2 things in games that I found very useful. First of all, identifying new connections between actors and their preferences and how they might respond. Part of, I think, of the advantage of an effective game is broadening the way you think about a problem and seeing how different actors relate to it. And the second one is, and that may be even more relevant for the Z3, a good simulation is one that forces you to think what's your real preferences, and maybe in the context of Israeli diaspora, what's your identity, what are the various dimensions of it.
Thanks, Udi. I would perhaps also add that I think a benchmark to go by is if at the end of the simulation, the people around the table, there'll be people in person but also on Zoom, had I wouldn't say an awakening, but have something new, have come out with a new insight, a different way of seeing things. I think that could be a good benchmark for a successful game that maybe put your back against the wall and forced you to think of something that you couldn't think of without that game. Yeah. Let's move to a bit of a difficult question, but I'll try in any case. Maybe I'll pose it first to you, Udi, because we are here in Israel. We know that there's a gap between how Israelis perceive this growing gap between Israel and Jewish Americans and the way that this is perceived on the other side in the United States. If we had to advise our Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Nachman Shai, and we had to essentially give him a couple of tips or pointers on how to engage the Israeli public in this issue, which is, it's not pertinent to their lives. We're dealing with very crucial national security things. We're dealing with daily traffic jams, with corona and everything else. What would you say to him? How can we get the Israeli public engaged?
Yeah, so I think one immediate answer, which we may not like so much, is show the value of this relationship. But that's almost too practical and interest-based. So I think what the solution lies in more long-term processes, introducing the role of the diaspora into our educational system, which has a heavy focus on our own story and the Zionist narrative, getting elites, as is being done now, to travel to the US, and open the public sphere to some of the influences that we are receiving from the US. Reform Judaism, Reconstruction, conservative. We have some pockets of it, but it runs into challenges in Israel. So if we open up to some of the benefits of the diaspora perspective on Jewish life, is even important for us, for our own conversation about ourselves. So I put most of my emphasis, I think, on long-term processes of education rather than anything immediate.
Thank you. And Scott, do you have any words of wisdom for our minister?
Thanks. I think Udi is absolutely right. Long-term socialization is, ultimately that it's a marathon, but raising levels of awareness, using the public sphere. I mean, I'll just give an example. The two of you probably know very well the annual Yom HaAtzmaut ceremony, Tekes Masuot, the 12 torches. 4 or 5 years ago, the government introduced this idea of the 12th torch to be lit by a representative of the diaspora. I think these long-term processes, raising basic levels of awareness, and here maybe I'll quibble with Udi a little bit, trying to get away from the sort of a crude notion that it's an instrumental relationship, that the diaspora is only there for advocacy, for immigration, for philanthropy, and focusing more broadly, bringing in the identity elements as well. So long-term processes of socialization on both sides, by the way. That particular ceremony, Yom HaAtzmaut, the 12 torches, is something that the vast majority of Jews in the diaspora actually aren't even aware of and have never watched, even if it's something that all Israelis are aware of and they see in their living rooms or in their public squares. For Nachman Shai, one last, and for those working on the Israel diaspora agenda, I would say what's really critical is setting the agenda, trying to more clearly identify and mark off the issues that really are sort of uniquely impactful within, I call these sort of internal affairs of the Jewish people, and drawing lines as much as you can with the other issues that are where Israelis and their politics and their society really should be making the decisions and be in the front of the discourse. Finding those boundary lines, identifying them, I think also gives Israelis more comfort that they can let down their guard, be less defensive when the diaspora voice comes in. There's an expression in Hebrew the two of you probably know. I've heard from others. You'll have to tell me if it's still relevant. Kesef zar horeset hamedina. Foreign money, foreign influence is sort of ruining the country. When the focus of the public discussion or the discourse or the crisis response is on an issue that is narrowly related to Israel diaspora affairs, to global Jewry, it's just very important that can be set apart from other issues that understandably make Israelis often feel defensive about any kind of external intervention, even if it's from world Jewry, questions of security, questions of their internal politics. So I think that agenda setting, marking off the issues that are fair game and that need to be put on the table from those that really are uniquely impactful and should be things that only Israelis are kind of at the forefront of. That's absolutely critical.
Thank you, Scott. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. So thank you, Scott, and thank you, Udi, for joining me in this discussion here in Tel Aviv. I'll take the liberty of concluding on behalf of all of us, Scott, Udi, by wishing all the Z3 in-person and Zoom participants a productive, a meaningful, a thought-provoking, and dare I say, a surprising simulation game. I'm looking forward to reading about its results. So thank you all for joining us, and from Washington and Tel Aviv, take care.